Well, absolutely. As far as we know, they are still talking. And this is a phone call now that's gone on for more than 2 hours, quite a lengthy phone call between President Putin and President Trump. Can we read anything into that? Potentially, yes. We know that President Trump has gone into this call saying that he's optimistic. He thinks that a deal can be reached. He thinks that ultimately both Ukraine and Russia will agree to a ceasefire. But it seems it's taken at least 2 hours to work out some of the details of whether this in fact will move forward. Incredibly important to note as well that Trump wants this done. He wants the US to withdraw from Ukraine support overall. I believe that, we could hear in the coming hours whether this ceasefire deal has in fact been agreed to, and also potentially some of the details, what the US has agreed to with regard to Russia, what the current status would be going forward with regard to who controls which land. We know, of course, that Russia has taken some of the land of Ukraine in recent years. Will Ukraine have to cede some of that land to Russia as part of this wider deal? Will Ukraine have to agree, or will European leaders have to agree that Ukraine will never be part of NATO? That's something we know has been on the cards. The US has spoken about that being something that's realistic going forward. There's even been suggestions that Ukraine might have to essentially give up 20% of its land. Some analysts saying as much as 25%. But, even once this call is done, if President Trump does get Putin to agree to some of these terms, he then has to go back to Ukraine. He then has to go back to President Zelensky and get Zelensky to agree, and of course the allies in Europe who are continuing to agree to back Ukraine. They are increasingly stepping up their military spending because the US is reducing theirs. We've had that conversation happening between the UK Prime Minister Starmer just last week with military leaders from around the region, talking about a coalition of the willing, talking about beefing up their own security, potentially having even boots on the ground in Ukraine, some suggestion they could make up some kind of ceasefire, peacekeeping force that could be along the border. All of these details, though, are not just difficult for Russia to agree upon, but also then for Ukraine to say, yes, it will accept some of these terms. I think if we do get an agreement of a deal today, we're likely to then see the Ukrainian President Zelensky back in the White House pretty soon, because the US will then want to put any remaining pressure it can on Ukraine to make sure this moves forward, because that's ultimately what President Trump, what the White House wants, is to get this deal done and to stop the US having to supply Ukraine with all these military aid.
Caroline, thank you for that. Our correspondent Caroline Malone in Washington.